He's been involved with self-storage for 56 years, nearly since the industry even got started. Today on Stories Behind the Door podcast, an absolute legend in our industry, the founder of Extra Space, Ken Woolley. Honestly, a pinch me day for me today on the Stories Behind the Door podcast. When I first started doing this podcast back in December of 22, never envisioned that I would come to this place where I'm able to welcome one of the Mount Rushmore, one of the most respected and most well-known folks in storage. And we're going to get right to it with Ken Woolley in a second. Before I do that, I'm your host, Thaddeus Campbell, S3 Partners. We've been building storage for 30 plus years, 300 plus ground up developments. If you have a piece of raw land, need some help, we can help make that dream come true. And of course, I've got to give a shout out to Wayne Woolsey and his incredible team at Kiwi 2 Construction. They've been proud supporters of the podcast for almost a full year now. We couldn't do this without them. So if you guys have any needs for steel in the small bay flex or storage industry, you can reach out to Kiwi Construction and they will be happy to help you guys. I'm going to jump right into it now. Ken Woolley, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come and join the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I have to say, I got introduced to you out in Snowmass at the Executive Ski Workshop. Noah Springer, who's been kind enough to come on the show before, introduced me to you. And everything I've heard about you, and I've heard about you from a whole bunch of people. I have a lot of guests that are past guests on the podcast that brought you up out of the blue without me asking about it. And all have said the same exact thing, which I got to experience firsthand, which is that you lead with kindness all the time. So know that that's appreciated and that precedes you in the industry. People talk about it to this day. So I want to take a second because one of the reasons I do this podcast and one of the things I love about self-storage is in general, the industry is so helpful of each other. And so to you, I just want to say thank you because you're one of those people that's helped lead that in this industry.
Well, I hope I am. I want to be that way. I feel like we're all friends. And I think one of the unique things about storage is that we are a friendly industry. We, as competitors, we're not sort of competitors. We're sort of friendly partners in many ways. And that's very different than other businesses that I've been involved in, which are not that way.
Myself as well. I got into storage just a few short years ago and worked in many other industries and never experienced anything quite like this. So want to just lead with that. I start the podcast with the same question all the time. Storage is such a niche asset. It's such a unique industry. And I've never heard anybody, even the people that had parents in the industry, say they set out to get into storage when they were young and going to school. How did Ken Woolley find himself building Extra Space?
Well, it started a long time ago, really at 56 years ago. I was in graduate school and I was working for a local developer in Menlo Park, California, and he was building a self-storage property. In some of you in the audience would know the Bayshore Freeway, and he bought a piece of land, and the land cost I think it was $40,000 an acre for 5 acres, $200,000. And we built this 80,000 foot project. And I was an intern in his office. I didn't build it. I was just a kid in college helping him out. And I remember it cost $5.26 a square foot to build it.
Love it.
It was the first one that I know of in the Bay Area. He had seen the idea in Austin, Texas, where it kind of originated in the 60s. And so he brought it to the Bay Area and we built this property and it leased up pretty rapidly. And, it was 5 by 10s, 10 by 10s, 10 by 20s, 10 by 30s, just like we do today. That was how I got my start. I was in college and I didn't go into the business right away, but that's how I learned about it.
Talk to me about that journey then. Went to Stanford for graduate school, BYU for undergrad, obviously Extra Space headquartered in Salt Lake City. Tell me about the journey leaving Stanford and then how you then got back into self-storage.
Well, I left Stanford and I went to work in Boston for the Boston Consulting Group, and I was a management consultant. And I lived there and I was traveling up and down the East Coast, and I noticed there was no storage in the East, didn't exist. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why don't they have it here? And a couple of years later, I was hired by what we would today call a family office. It was a wealthy family in Cody, Wyoming. And I moved from Boston to Wyoming. And I worked for this family who was in the oil business. And I said, hey, we need to get in this storage business. And they said, well, you've been a consultant. Why don't you go do a study for us? So I did a study, and this was in 1973. And I went to Los Angeles and I visited every storage property in the greater LA area. There were 26 of them. And I talked to the managers, and talked to a couple of developers, and they were leasing up very rapidly. And I thought, wow, this is a pretty good business. And then I went to Phoenix, Arizona, and I went to Austin, Texas, and Houston, and I saw properties there. This is really early days for storage. And came back and wrote up a big report. I wish I had that report. I don't have it. It's somehow lost in history. But
I think there's a lot of people that wish you had that
yeah,
report. That would be some
if
intense
I
reading
do
for a lot of
remember
folks.
this, I remember reporting that we thought maybe someday we'd get to 1 square foot per capita as the amount of stores that would kind of
That's great.
maximize the demand. And I went to my boss and I said, hey, we need to get in this business. We didn't. They went on
I
to other things. This was 73, but later on in 1976, I convinced him privately to do a storage project. I said, let's do one. And the closest town of any size to Cody, Wyoming was Billings, Montana. So we built a property in Billings, Montana, my boss and I together. It was initially 40,000 square feet. And the year later, we added another 20,000. And it was a steel building. It was a simple project, generation one storage. It leased right up. It was profitable. And I remember our takeout mortgage was at 10% interest from a little life insurance company. So that was my first, and we called it Security Mini Storage. That was the name of it. And I hired the managers, and I did the lock checks, and I did the vacates, and we didn't even have a computer. In those days, it was all a card system, but it very much the same it is today in many ways.
It's funny how many people don't remember the old swiper that they used to
Yeah,
give
we
you if
did
you
that.
had a credit card,
Yeah.
right? That's great.
I
I
still
want to
have
ask you.
I have photos today of me cutting locks and then having a photo of what was inside with it showing the date so that we could auction off the goods and do all that. Anyway.
That's fantastic. Following the rules. I want to touch on a couple of things. You talked $5 a square foot for the project out in California,
Yes.
right? And obviously we're into the triple digits now on hard costs for,
Right. Exactly.
maybe you could stay under, but in California, you're hard pressed to stay under triple digits on hard
Yeah.
costs. Talk to me about that evolution of storage. And you mentioned the $40,000 a square foot or $40,000 an acre for 5 acres of land, $200,000 for 5 acres in greater San Francisco. Good luck with that, right? You're $1 million plus an acre. Talk to me about the evolution for you and what it's been like to kind of watch that whole change as storage has really become a mainstream industrial asset at this
It
point.
has. Well, I don't think in the 70s and 80s, we named the company in Extra Space Storage in 1979, and I quit my job in Wyoming and I moved to Utah, and I became a professor at Brigham Young University in the business school, and I started under the name Extra Space, which was a name that was dreamed up with some friends. We had a brainstorming session, and one of my friends came up with the name Extra Space. So we called the company Extra Space, and our first Extra Space property was in Utah. It was in Orem, Utah. We own it today. It's on the corner of I-15 and Center Street. But anyway, in those days, we were building what we call first-generation properties. But even the third property I built was 2-story, and it was in San Jose, California. I realized that the bigger demand was in the bigger cities, and California seemed like a good place. And I had grown up in California. I'm not from Utah. I'm from the Bay Area originally. And actually I was born in LA, but later moved to the Bay Area. And so our second and third projects were one in San Jose and one in Baldwin Park. And they were multi-story, 2-story properties with walk-up stairs in those days, no elevators, nothing like that.
Yep.
But during the 80s, there was no climate control. And the 2-story projects that were around were either using lifts or they were using, walk-ups, just walk-ups. And a lot of properties were built out of wood. I pretty much went to steel or block with what I only built one project, I think, out of frame. And of course, things evolved. And so by the early 90s, people were building 3-story properties and 4-story properties and started doing climate control. And in the early days, I was building, I went to Boston in 1982 and started and opened an office there and started rapidly or really focusing on Boston. And I remember building a climate controlled property in Foxborough, Mass in 1992. And we couldn't get a premium for the climate control because no one thought you would need it or why would you have it? Yep. And so there was a big evolution that occurred going from, just simple storage to climate controlled and, air conditioning of course, in the South, air conditioning. But I built one in Florida in 1981 in Orlando, all single story drive up. No one even thought of air conditioning. So the biggest change is physically in the buildings. I mean, we do multi-story now, and we do air conditioning and refrigerate and heat. And of course, now the computer system is different too.
A lot of innovation on that
Mhm.
side. You
A lot
brought
of
up
innovation.
Foxborough. I'm from Massachusetts, and the Patriots in the Super Bowl, so I got to
Yeah,
give a go Pats real quick.
yeah,
You built a
Foxborough.
storage facility in Foxborough. I'm interested to pick your brain a little bit because obviously coming from New England, storage is not anywhere near the as recognizable as if you go down to Texas. There's just not as much of it, right?
That's right.
People have basements in their house, and
That's right.
the square foot for you brought up square foot per capita too, which I think is
Uh-huh.
great that you wondered if it ever get to one. I think we just passed 7 last year, which is crazy. Maurice Pagoda, another person who's been really integral in the growth of self-storage, national storage up in Michigan. He talked to me about in the 80s how if a market had 2 square foot per capita, he wouldn't build there, which I
Exactly.
think is hilarious now, right? As we're getting to, sometimes there's markets in Florida, there'll be 10 square foot per capita, and you'll still see new developments going in. Talk to me a little bit about that, and especially now as Extra Space is 4,000 locations, counting third
Right.
party management. Talk to me about the proliferation of development and how do you guys see what's going on in that world and just the amount of new capacity that's coming into the industry?
Okay, well, first I want to talk about this. I'll go from square foot per capita to kind of how the industry developed.
Yep.
Um, in the early days, and I'm talking about the 80s and even early 90s,
Mm.
a large portion of people in America didn't know what a self-storage was. So if they drove by it, they didn't know it existed. And that's why it was important in those days to have a big sign on the freeway that said Extra Space or Public Storage or whatever name storage company, and that you needed to see the doors, and and then it would be top of mind. So when the need arose, they would say, "Oh yeah, there's that storage place. I might go to that." But in those days, the penetration was only 2 or 3% of the population using it. And what that meant was in those early days, you build a property and it really took 3 to 4 years to fill it. You couldn't fill it very fast because there just wasn't enough demand, even in the denser areas.
Yeah.
And so over time, as storage became really everybody knows about it now. Everybody knows what it is. So now when when the need arises, people know that it's there and they'll go lease. And that's made a big difference because over in the last 15 years, you can pretty well lease, build a property in a good location and you're going to get it leased up.
Yeah.
And that wasn't true 25 years ago.
I'm fascinated to ask you this question. The recent study from the SSA says 16% of millennials and 16% of Gen Z are renting storage. I think the number was 6% for baby boomers. I'm Gen X. I think we were at like 8 or 12 or something like
Mhm.
that. Is that a shock to you, having been around in self-storage from the 1970s, to think that 16% of people in a whole generation would be actually renting storage facilities?
No, not at all. What I see is in America, we are consumers and we buy all this stuff from China and Vietnam and wherever else it's made, Germany or whatever. We bring it into this country and we bring it into our houses. And pretty much all this stuff we buy overflows our houses. And this storage is sort of a final resting place of all the stuff we don't need, but we don't want to throw away. And there's a continuous increase in the amount of that stuff. And so as kind of I see it, we're sort of 12%, I think, of the US population today,
Yep.
Gen X and Gen Z bigger. I'm surprised that if there's any surprise to me is the baby boomers are not bigger. I'm a baby boomer.
Yeah.
And I'm actually on the very leading edge of that because I'm 79 years old and I was born just after World War II ended. So, but as I see it, this business and it's going to continue to grow
Yeah.
because what happens is the older storage projects are filled up with stuff that's been in there for 10 years or longer and never moves. And so it's like it's only turning on the top 50% of the storage project and the rest of it just sitting there forever. And once you fill that up and you build a new one, then there's new people that need to store and there's an ever increasing demand for it. So which is really happening. Now, during recently, there's a couple of things that made storage now everybody knows what it is. and it's a great business. But the oversupply of the last few years, which we've seen, was caused, I think, by three factors. The first was during the pandemic, storage rents went way up because for some reason people stored a lot of stuff. We didn't think that was going to happen 6 years ago in March when the pandemic happened. We were all didn't know what was going to happen, but we all did know what did happen, and that is that rents went way up and the storage properties went to 90% occupancy. And everybody looked at, wow, look at and also cap rates were low at that time with interest rates low. So everybody plowed in and built storage projects. That was facilitated partly by ourselves and CubeSmart and Public Storage providing management services. It made it much easier for people to develop and not have to build a management platform, which is difficult in our business. So that's what happened. Now we're in this phase of cap rates went back up, storage rents have come down, and we're in a tighter spot right now. It's a harder time today. I don't know. This is sort of rehashing what most of us already know.
Yeah, listen, it's more fun to have it rehashed by you. I can promise you that, and takes a lot more weight. I want to talk about something you mentioned earlier. You talked about the life insurance recapitalizing the initial storage facility you bought when you were you were an intern in the group at 10% interest with a life insurance company, which is really funny because typically you can get a little bit better rate from life insurance than from a traditional bank. Talk to me a little bit about where we're at with interest rates today. You know, figure low to mid sixes if you're doing long-term debt, maybe a little lower if you're with life insurance company. People are talking or sometimes even banking on interest rates coming back down, and they'll say coming back down again. Nobody ever says going back up again. I'm old enough. I got enough gray hair to remember, mid-teen to high-teen to even low-20 mortgage rates on houses in the early 80s. Should we get used to 6% interest rates and be okay with that and adjust to that? Where do you see that going, and what's your perspective on that, given your...
My perspective is that we are at a substantial risk because the size of the deficit and the need to finance that deficit to have higher interest rates for some time to come. And I think we have to readjust to that. And that's hard because what happens, so many of us are, that puts a damper. What it does is it makes cap rates not so great. So cap rates have come up to the mid fives and even six, depending, and even seven, depending on the type of property. The best properties in the best locations, I would guess, are high fours today, which is a negative arbitrage on interest rates. And that's a problem. But it's not only trouble in storage, it's a problem in multifamily and industrial and most real estate types. So I'm not a prognosticator, but I am not optimistic that rates are going to go down. So I don't see. And now, just for retrospective, the second permanent loan I ever got in a storage project was in 1981, and it was at 14% interest fixed for 5 years. And the lender got a 40% upside above the loan as their equity participation in order to make the loan.
So to get a 14% rate, you had to give up 40%
And
equity
what's
in the
interesting
project.
about it is it covered all the costs and it cash flowed. That's how good it cash flowed. And the lender was Public Storage in 1981. And that's how I got to know Public Storage. And for a year, I worked for Wayne Hughes at Public Storage in 1982 and was their head of acquisitions during this real tough time of interest rates.
It was the early 80s, right? When things went really haywire, and the attempt to fix that led to some more serious problems at the end of the 80s, which we could bring up. But that's a whole...
the cap rates on storage during the 80s was 10. That's what the cap rates were. And they got up as high as 11 to 12 in the early 90s. And then back by the mid 90s, it was 10 again. It didn't start dropping below 10 until the early 2000s. We did a
fascinating conversation.
Anyway,
go ahead, keep talking. I
was going
apologize.
to say that we saw the cap by 2005, cap rates were at 7, and we did a large acquisition of Storage USA, 450 properties. It was $2.3 billion shortly after we went public, and that was at a flat 7 cap. Now you can't buy stuff at a 7 cap today. So you can see cap rates are lower and values are higher.
Yeah, unless you want to go to suburban Wisconsin, you have a hard time finding a 7 cap deal, and even then it's a challenge.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. Let's talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about this idea of what's happening in the amount of capital. Public Storage did their quarter earnings call. 5.25 cap was their acquisitions, was their average of acquisitions
Mhm.
over the course of the quarter. And you talked about this idea of negative arbitrage. How are we continuing that now? What's almost 3 full years since the first interest rate hike? And we've continued to see it where, it made sense to have a 4.5 cap purchase in 2022 when you could go borrow money at three,
Right.
3.25. We're still seeing 5.25 cap deals when traditional banking 6.5. How's that continuing to
Well,
happen in your
that
estimation?
happens because people use lower leverage and they believe and they pro forma future rent increases that will give them an adequate return on equity. And so, you can afford to borrow at 6 or 6.25, whatever it is in that range. If your loan level is 60% or 55% rather than 90-80%, and then your equity initially isn't going to yield that. But if you're optimistic and you see the economy growing and you see things getting better, or this particular property has some upside, then you're going to get a decent return on capital. Plus, there's a tremendous amount of cash that's come in on the equity side that's chasing these deals. And it's difficult for Extra Space because our stock isn't particularly high right now. It isn't high. So we can't use equity dollars to buy things. So we can use debt, but our debt costs are in the low fives right now, which is about as cheap as anybody's going to get it. So we are still buying. We bought $1.2 billion worth of properties during 2025.
Not a bad year's work. Let's talk about this a little bit. That just end of last week, the announcement that Storage Mart, Manhattan Mini Storage, acquires a little over $1 billion in a 15-store portfolio in New York City. You guys, obviously, the Life Storage merger a few years
Mhm.
ago. The appetite for storage from big equity, it seems like it's not slowing down. Talk to me a little bit about maybe what the Manhattan Mini Storage acquisition in New York means from a macro view for the industry, and of course what you guys did with Life Storage.
Well, I don't like to comment on other people's deals, but there's a buying price and a selling price. And if you're a seller, you in the original Manhattan Mini Storage deal was done what, 3.5, 4 years ago,
Yeah.
and the family of the Gottesman family owned it and had built it up and sold it, and we were in there wanting to buy. We didn't pay, or we didn't bid what the Storage Mart people bid for it. And at that time, the cap rate was in the threes. That was what it sold for, about 3.3 billion, as I remember. But it's been harder because there's been a lot of new development come in Manhattan. I don't think there's been a lot of rent increases. So that's a financial play that's difficult. On the other hand, you can look at Manhattan and say this is one of the better places to invest over the long term. So if you take a long term view and say, where am I going to put my dollars? There's a lot of people, including the people that are behind Storage Mart, including the Gates Foundation and the government of Singapore, who is their big investor, and Stan Kroenke, who is the main owner of Storage Mart, is, I think, looking at it as a long-term play. I don't know much about the new portfolio they bought, but I'm sure they carefully looked at it and they wanted to buy it, and it was a good portfolio for them. And by the way, right now, if you look at storage today, the better markets are in the Northeast and in the northern part of the Midwest. They're not in the Sun Belt.
I think that's fascinating. It ties into our conversation earlier about development, right? And where were people running to during that boom of COVID, and even a little bit before in 17, 18, 19, the Sun Belt was all the rage. And at a certain level, there's supply and demand, right? If there's too much supply and not enough demand, it doesn't tend to be as beneficiary to the folks
But
building.
what will happen here with this excess supply that we've had, and particularly in the Sun Belt markets, it will get absorbed,
Yeah.
and then we'll see rent increases again. But right now, it's a little more difficult time.
I'm interested to go down this road because I think one of the reasons you mentioned being in Boston and the challenge of developing in the Northeast. I live in New
Yeah, oh,
Jersey, obviously spent a lot of time in New York City. The hurdles to get something out of the ground in some of these areas are massive.
it
How
is.
does Extra Space view that? And that's something you guys are willing to deal with, to have that kind of protection of your asset.
Well, first of all, Extra Space is not today in the development business. We are primarily buying properties and managing properties, and we like to buy in those difficult markets where it's hard to develop. Now, I experienced that. I mean, I personally was involved in maybe 30 developments in the greater Boston area, spending a lot of time looking at land and working on permitting. And, California is just as hard. New York's just as hard. New Jersey, these are all different. Pennsylvania's a little easier. Washington, D.C. is tough. If I were developing today, I would continue to develop in those tough markets where there's not as much. It's so difficult to do because then you create an asset and you have something that has kind of a quasi monopoly of your neighborhood. I remember building one in Quincy, Massachusetts. It's just really hard to build there. And you look at the over time, the cash flow of those properties over extended period of time do better than the super competitive, easily to build markets.
I'm going to pivot a little bit, and I'd be remiss if I didn't go down this road. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Andrew Jones, who spent time at Extra Space before, he's now very well known for Truck Parking Club. My friend Buddy Morgan is a developer in Oklahoma City, spent a couple years working for Extra Space before he embarked on that journey. Alyssa Quill, Noah Springer, Mitch Feldman, who's a developer I'm close friends with, Tony Artizzoni, so many people that have been on this podcast that have brought you up and brought up Extra Space and the way that you guys operate. Obviously, Joe Margolis and Noah Springer and Zach Dickens, the kind of leadership team that you have in place there now, have been with the company for 2 decades plus. What is it about Ken Woolley's vision and the way that you built this company that has engendered the kind of feelings that people have for Extra Space?
I can answer it, but I don't know if I have fully the answer. First of all, there's an old Extra Space and a new Extra Space. The new Extra Space began in 1998 with a partnership with a man named Spencer Kirk, who became our CEO for a while. When Spencer and I sat down to build the new Extra Space, we had some guiding principles, and several of them were as follows: provide an excellent product and an excellent service, develop and maintain mutually beneficial business relationships. That means having partnerships and working with other people and being friendly and being win-win. And we have tried to do that, and I think we have done that. People want to work with us because we don't try and grab the last dollar. We're not trying to hurt somebody else. We're trying to be in a partnership relationship. And one of the reasons we have such a successful management platform is we try and treat the Tony artists, all these people you just mentioned, we try and treat them as our friends and our partners, and we try and work together. And that's unique, I think, in our company. We try and we work hard to maintain a great employee relations in our company, to make it win-win, to make people positive. I really believe, and this is a core belief of mine, that business can be done successfully by both sides of a transaction winning. And I believe that, and it's happened in my life, and I see it every day. I had a friend in business school, and he said there are 2 types of people in the world, the screwies and the screwers. And which one do you want to be? And I thought to myself, no, that is not the truth. That is not, some people think of the world that way. I don't think of the world that way. And neither does Zach Dickens, and neither does Joe Margolis, and neither does Noah Springer. And our whole management team thinks the opposite way. We think that business should be win-win, and that we should try together to have a successful business. So that's part of our culture. It's just who we are.
I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, that you're to be commended for what you built. And listen, if you ask enough people, there's always going to be someone who's going to say something negative. That goes part and parcel with the world of getting to a certain level of success. And I'll let other folks deal with that. But for me, I love this industry so much, and I'm so thankful that I didn't get into it until I was 47, 48 years old and had a frame of reference to really appreciate what it is and what folks like you that helped build this industry into what it is today have created. I try very hard to honor the half-hour rule. We've already gone a little bit over that, and I very much appreciate that. I hope someday you'll be willing to come back on, because God knows I could ask you another hour's worth of questions. Had an absolute blast hanging out with you, and thanks so much for sharing so much with us.
Thanks, everybody. All right.
Want to give one last shout out to my friends at Kiwi 2 Construction, Wayne Woolsey and his team. Again, just like Ken, years of decades of experience in the self-storage industry. They are the leaders in building steel structures. When they say it's going to get done, it gets done. You can reach out to them at kiwiconstruction.com if you have any needs for steel structures, building self-storage, or small bay flex. He's Kenneth Woolley, Mount Rushmore of self-storage, folks.
Not really.
Literally, I'm going to say that. I feel very comfortable saying that. I don't think I'm getting a little pushback on that one. Founder of Extra Space, and just genuinely someone who is respected throughout the industry. Thanks so much for your time. That's it for this week's episode of Stories Behind the Door. We'll see everyone next week.
Thank you.